A few years ago, I killed a plant by being a good plant parent. I followed the rule everyone tells you, the one printed on nursery tags and repeated in every beginner gardening article that has ever been written. Water it once a week. I did that faithfully, every Sunday. Like clockwork, the same time, the same amount, the same careful little ritual. And the leaves still turned yellow and dropped one by one until there was nothing left but a sad bare stem sitting in a pot of soggy dirt. I genuinely could not understand it. I had done everything right. I had followed the instructions exactly as they were given to me, and the plant died anyway, which felt less like a gardening failure and more like a personal betrayal from the universe. So I assumed the obvious thing. I must have underwatered it. The rule clearly was not wrong. I must have simply not followed it closely enough. So the next plant I brought home, I watered more generously, more often, determined not to make the same mistake twice. That plant died too, and it died faster than the first one, and when I finally pulled it out of the pot to see what had gone wrong, the roots came out looking like wet brown string, slimy and falling apart in my hands instead of firm and white the way healthy roots should look. Two completely different plants, two completely opposite approaches. One under the rule, one well past the rule. And somehow, the exact same outcome, a dead plant and a confused person standing in their kitchen wondering what they were missing. That contradiction is what eventually pushed me to stop repeating the advice everyone hands you at the garden center and actually go looking for where that advice came from in the first place. And what I found across the research is that almost everything most people believe about watering plants is either dangerously incomplete or flatly wrong, repeated so often and so confidently that nobody ever stops to ask where the number actually came from. Today we are going to walk through where this advice originated, why it keeps failing people who follow it with perfect discipline, what is actually happening underground in the soil where none of us can see it, and what the real research says you should be doing instead. I think by the end of this, you are going to look at every plant in your home completely differently, and you are probably going to feel a little bit angry about how simple the real answer turns out to be once somebody actually explains it to you. Before I start tearing apart the bad advice, I want to give you the real foundation underneath it, because the popular version of watering advice did not come from nowhere. It is a real biological concept that has been stretched and flattened into a rule it was never designed to support, and understanding the real mechanism is the only way the rest of this is going to make sense. Plants take up water through tiny structures on their roots called root hairs, using a pressure difference that plant physiologists call osmotic potential. Essentially, the concentration of dissolved minerals inside the root cells is higher than the concentration in the surrounding soil water, so water moves into the root the same way water naturally moves from an area of lower concentration to higher concentration across a membrane. Once that water is inside the root, it travels upward through a specialized tissue called the xylem, and the engine pulling it up that entire distance, sometimes many feet for a large plant, is something called transpiration, which is simply water evaporating out of tiny pores on the underside of the leaves, called stomata. The evaporation at the top creates a pulling force, like a very long, thin straw, that draws water continuously upward from the roots to replace what was lost. Here is the detail that almost nobody includes when they hand you a watering schedule, and it is the single most important fact in this entire video. Roots do not just need water. They need oxygen too, and they pull that oxygen from air pockets that exist naturally in the gaps between soil particles. Healthy soil is not solid. It is closer to a sponge, full of tiny air pockets that roots breathe through the same way your lungs use the air pockets in a healthy set of alveoli. If the soil stays fully saturated with water for an extended period, those air pockets fill with water instead of air, and the roots begin to suffocate. They do not rot because there is too much water touching them directly. They rot because the water has displaced the oxygen they need to survive, and the anaerobic bacteria that thrive specifically in airless wet conditions move in and begin breaking down the now oxygen-starved root tissue. This means the yellow leaves on my first plant and the mushy black roots on my second plant were actually two versions of the same underlying failure, arriving through two completely different routes. My first plant was thirst-stressed, genuinely dry at the root level, unable to maintain enough water pressure to keep its leaf cells firm, so they yellowed and dropped as the plant sacrificed older leaves to conserve resources for survival. My second plant was suffocating, sitting in soil with no oxygen left in it at all, its roots dying from lack of air, while the plant above ground had no way of immediately signaling that anything was wrong, because the visible symptoms of root rot often take days to show up in the leaves after the actual damage has already happened underground. A popular gardening chart will tell you to fix both of these completely opposite problems with the exact same once-a-week pour from the exact same watering can, which should already tell you something is deeply wrong with the advice itself. If you actually go looking at credible sources that should, in theory, agree with each other on something as basic as watering frequency, they genuinely do not, and the gap between them is wide enough that it cannot be explained away as a minor rounding difference. A houseplant care guide published by a major home and garden retailer, the kind of guide printed and handed out at checkout counters, recommends watering most common indoor plants on a fixed weekly schedule, with small variations noted only between broad categories like succulents versus tropical foliage plants. It is simple, it is printable, and it gives a nervous new plant owner a clear number to hold on to. A university extension horticulture department, the kind of program that exists specifically to give home gardeners and commercial growers research-backed advice, completely free of charge, takes a fundamentally different position. Their published guidance recommends watering based on soil moisture measured at root depth, checked physically by hand or with a simple moisture meter, with no fixed schedule mentioned anywhere in the material. Their position is explicit that a calendar-based watering schedule cannot account for the variables that actually determine when a plant needs water. And a peer-reviewed study examining container-grown ornamental plants under controlled conditions found that the soil moisture level at which a given plant species actually begins to experience measurable physiological stress varies enormously depending on the species itself, the material the pot is made from, and even the specific blend of components in the potting mix being used. The researchers were explicit in their conclusions, warning directly against the application of universal watering schedules across different plant types, stating that doing so was likely to produce inconsistent and sometimes harmful results precisely because the underlying variables differ so significantly from one growing situation to the next. There is a fourth source worth mentioning too, because it complicates the picture even further rather than simplifying it. A widely shared gardening blog, the kind that ranks highly in search results and gets cited constantly by other smaller sites, recommends checking the weight of the pot before and after watering, training yourself to recognize the difference between a heavy, recently watered pot and a noticeably lighter, dried-out one. This is actually a reasonably sound method in practice, but it is almost never mentioned alongside the weekly schedule advice, even though the two pieces of guidance contradict each other directly. If pot weight is genuinely the signal worth paying attention to, then a calendar date has nothing to do with anything at all. Four credible, well-intentioned sources, each one written by people who presumably wanted to help plant owners succeed. Four meaningfully different conclusions about how often and under what conditions a plant should actually be watered. And only one of those four approaches is actually built from the ground up on what the individual plant sitting in front of you genuinely needs in that moment, rather than on what happens to fit cleanly onto a small printed tag, a simply memorized rule of thumb, or a habit that simply outlived the reasons it was created. I wanted to know who actually started this rule, because the deeper I looked, the more I noticed that nobody seems to be able to point to a specific origin, a specific study, a specific horticulturist who tested it and found it to be reliable, and that absence is itself the answer to the question. The once-a-week watering rule was never tested in any formal sense. It is not a finding that emerged from research. It is a convenience habit that spread primarily through nursery tag printing and Home and Garden magazine articles, for reasons that have far more to do with the physical constraints of a small plastic plant tag than with the actual biological needs of the plant attached to it. A commercial nursery growing thousands of units of a single plant species for mass retail distribution has no way of knowing what kind of light your specific home receives, what material your specific pot is made from, what the humidity level in your specific room tends to sit at, or what soil mix the plant is eventually going to end up in once you bring it home and possibly repot it into something different than what it shipped in. They genuinely cannot print an instruction that says check the soil moisture at root depth with your finger before deciding whether to water, because that instruction requires a sentence, sometimes two, and the little plastic tag does not have room for a sentence. It has room for a short phrase and a single number. So the industry, almost universally, printed a number instead of a method, and that number was never actually about the specific plant you brought home. It was about the physical size constraints of a printed tag, repeated by enough nurseries and enough magazine writers for enough decades, that it eventually hardened into something that sounds, to most people, like settled scientific fact, even though it never passed through anything resembling a scientific process at all. I want you to picture yourself shrunk down to the size of a single root hair, sitting near the edge of a dense root ball packed inside a plastic nursery pot, because this is the part of the story that almost never gets told, simply because nobody can actually see it happening. Right after a thorough watering, you are surrounded on every side by water, and you drink freely, the pressure inside your cells rising as you take in everything available to you. The first day passes uneventfully. The water sitting nearest the drainage holes at the bottom of the pot is the first to disappear, pulled steadily downward and out by gravity, draining away the way it is supposed to. But the water sitting in the dense center of the root ball, packed tightly between thousands of other roots, with nowhere obvious to go, has no clear path to drain through and very little surface area exposed to the air for evaporation. It largely just sits there, trapped in place by the sheer density of the root structure surrounding it. By the third day, something has changed. You are no longer actively drinking, because the oxygen that used to occupy the air pockets immediately around you has been displaced entirely by standing water, and a root without oxygen cannot maintain the basic cellular processes it needs to keep functioning. Anaerobic bacteria, the kind that specifically thrive in airless, waterlogged conditions, begin to multiply rapidly in the space around you, and they begin attacking your outer cell walls, breaking down the very tissue that used to be your protective barrier. By the fifth day, you are not a living root anymore. You are dead, decaying tissue sitting in standing water, and the plant above you, the leaves and stems that someone is still admiring on their windowsill, has no visible idea yet that anything has gone wrong. Because the visible symptoms of this kind of root death typically take several more days to travel upward and show themselves as wilting, yellowing, or leaf drop. By the time a person notices the warning signs above the soil line, the actual damage underground has often already been progressing silently for the better part of a week. Now picture the alternate version of yourself, the root hair belonging to the first plant I described at the start of this video, the one I watered faithfully every single Sunday and still managed to kill. In that version, the water arrives once, briefly soaks the soil, and is gone again within a day or two in a small pot with fast drainage, well before the next scheduled watering 7 days later is due. For 5 of those 7 days, you are not suffocating in standing water. You are simply dry, slowly losing internal pressure, your cell walls beginning to collapse inward from the lack of available water, a process called plasmolysis, until the entire plant begins sacrificing its oldest leaves first, redirecting whatever moisture remains toward the newest growth in a last effort to survive. 2 root hairs, 2 entirely different deaths, and the only thing they actually had in common was a calendar that had nothing to do with either one of them. A study that placed moisture sensors directly at root depth in identical potting mix, tracking exactly how long it took the soil to dry out, to the point where a given plant actually needed rewatering, found that the time frame ranged from as little as 2 days to as long as 17 days, depending entirely on pot size, the material the pot was made from, and the ambient humidity of the room, while holding the plant species itself completely constant across every test group. Terracotta pots, which are naturally porous and allow moisture to evaporate gradually through the walls of the pot itself, rather than only through the soil surface, dried out nearly 3 times faster than plastic pots, holding the exact same plant species in the exact same room, under the exact same lighting conditions. A fixed 7-day watering schedule applied uniformly across that entire range of outcomes means that some of those plants were being watered roughly 3 times more often than they actually needed, drowning their roots in the slow, silent way described above, while others were being watered at less than half the frequency they genuinely required, leaving them chronically thirsty and stressed in a different but equally damaging direction. The schedule was not occasionally a little bit wrong in this study. It was almost never precisely correct for any individual plant, in any individual pot, in any individual room, which is about as strong a piece of evidence as you could ask for that the entire premise of a universal watering number was flawed from the very beginning. There are a handful of genuine explanations for why this myth has managed to survive for as long as it has, despite how shaky the actual evidence underneath it turns out to be. And I think it is worth walking through all 4, honestly, because they are not all equally strong, and being clear about which ones are weak is part of being honest about this whole topic. The first real explanation is genuine survivorship among unusually hardy species. Certain extremely tolerant houseplants, the kind that have evolved to handle a remarkably wide range of moisture conditions without dying, will often survive a rigid weekly schedule simply because they are capable of surviving almost anything you throw at them. This makes the schedule look like it is working correctly, when in reality, the plant is simply forgiving enough to absorb the inconsistency without showing obvious symptoms. The second explanation is straightforward confirmation bias. When a plant eventually dies, most people instinctively blame the specific plant species, the lighting conditions in their home, or simple bad luck, rather than questioning whether the watering schedule they were told to follow might have been the actual root cause. Because the rule itself is rarely questioned, it never accumulates blame even in situations where it directly caused the failure, which allows it to keep being repeated as reliable advice indefinitely. The third explanation involves a kind of genuine seasonal coincidence. During active growing seasons with longer daylight hours and warmer temperatures, many common houseplants do consume water at a rate that happens to land somewhere reasonably close to a roughly weekly rhythm, which gives the fixed schedule a degree of occasional real-world accuracy, purely as a coincidence of seasonal timing, rather than because the underlying rule itself is sound. The fourth explanation, and I genuinely think this is the weakest of the 4, is that the advice simply sounds more authoritative because it is specific. A clean, confident number like once a week feels, to most people, like it must be backed by real expertise, even though that specific number is precisely the part of the advice with no actual research behind it. Meanwhile, the instruction to physically check the soil yourself, which sounds vague and unscientific by comparison, is the exact piece of guidance that every credible horticulture program actually recommends. The version that sounds more like science is the version built on nothing, and the version that sounds like a casual suggestion is the one built on actual plant physiology. There is a fifth factor worth naming honestly, even though it is less a reason the myth survives and more a reason nobody has fully replaced it. The finger test, the soil check, the pot weight method, all of these require a small amount of ongoing attention and a small amount of trust in your own judgment, and a fixed number requires neither. It is simply easier, in the short term, to follow a number than to develop a feel for a living thing's actual needs, and that ease is worth being honest about, even if it is also exactly what causes so many otherwise careful people to lose plants they were trying hard to take care of. The real method, once you strip away everything else, is genuinely simple, and it adjusts itself automatically for every single variable that a printed schedule has no way of accounting for. Push your finger directly into the soil, down to roughly the second knuckle, which puts you at a depth close enough to where the active root system is doing most of its work. If the soil still feels noticeably damp or cool at that depth, the plant does not need water yet, regardless of what day of the week it happens to be, or how long it has been since the last time you watered. Wait, and check again in a day or two. If the soil feels dry at that depth, water the plant thoroughly, slowly enough that the water has time to soak downward, rather than running straight through the surface and out the drainage holes without actually reaching the lower root zone, until you see water draining out of the bottom of the pot. Then let the soil dry out again, checking periodically with the same finger test, before repeating the entire process. That is the complete method, and the reason it works so much better than any printed number is that it responds directly to what is actually happening in that specific pot, in that specific room, with that specific plant, on that specific day, rather than asking a single average number to somehow be correct for every possible combination of those variables at once. It is worth being specific about how this plays out differently across the kinds of plants people actually tend to keep, because the finger test does not mean identical treatment for every species, and pretending otherwise would just be replacing one oversimplified rule with another. A succulent, or a cactus, evolved for environments where water is scarce and unpredictable, stores moisture directly in its leaves and stems. And for these plants, you genuinely want the soil to dry out almost completely, well below just the top 2 inches, before watering again, because their root systems are adapted to long, dry stretches and will rot quickly in soil that stays even lightly moist for an extended period. A tropical foliage plant, the kind that evolved under a rainforest canopy with consistent humidity and frequent rainfall, generally prefers the opposite end of that range, tolerating soil that stays lightly moist rather than fully drying out between waterings, though still never sitting in standing water at the base of the pot. A plant in active new growth during spring and summer will typically draw water faster than the same plant sitting dormant through the winter months, which means the actual interval between waterings for a single plant you own might shift meaningfully across the year, even though the finger test itself never changes. None of this requires memorizing a separate number for every plant you own. It only requires checking the soil and knowing, broadly, whether the plant in front of you evolved to expect long dry spells or constant moisture, which most plant tags will tell you even if they get the watering frequency itself wrong. The plant I killed twice was never genuinely confused about what it needed to survive. I was the one who was confused, following a number I had been handed instead of paying actual attention to what was happening in the soil directly in front of me, underground, in the one place a printed schedule could never see and never account for. Once you stop scheduling and start checking, you stop fighting against your plants and start actually listening to them, responding to what they are individually telling you rather than what a small plastic tag printed by a stranger told you to assume. That one shift in approach, simple as it sounds, will likely save more plants in your home over the next year than any fertilizer, any grow light, or any other gardening product you could possibly buy. Tell me in the comments which plant you have personally killed the most times, and whether you think, looking back now, it was thirst or drowning that actually got it. I genuinely want to know.